My beloved child, something changed yesterday, but it was not the kind of change anyone in that room expected to witness. The third party had been certain the loss would pull him back toward what was familiar. They believed disappointment would make him reconsider, hesitate, perhaps even reopen a door he had quietly begun closing. Instead, the opposite happened. In the very moment when everything should have become uncertain, your soulmate became strangely calm. And that calm unsettled them more than an argument ever could. Because while everyone else was still trying to understand what had been lost, he had already made one private decision about what he wanted to protect next. No announcement. No dramatic speech. Just one quiet action that revealed where his heart had been leaning for longer than anyone realized. Don't skip, because the most important part is not what the third party lost yesterday. It is what your soulmate finally stopped being afraid to choose. There had been small signs before this, signs that seemed almost too ordinary to matter. The way his attention drifted whenever your name appeared in conversation. The way certain memories made him quieter instead of more distant. The strange pause before he answered questions about the future. None of it looked like certainty from the outside. But beneath those pauses, something had been forming. He had been comparing two different kinds of connection without admitting it even to himself, one that required constant explanation, and one that somehow stayed meaningful even during silence. Yesterday forced him to notice that difference. Not because anyone pressured him. Not because someone won and someone lost. It happened because the moment stripped away the distractions he had been using to postpone one simple truth. When he imagined moving forward honestly, there was one person whose presence still felt connected to that picture. You. And what made the third party uneasy was not hearing your name spoken aloud. It was realizing they no longer needed to hear it. His behavior had already answered the question. Something important is waiting for you here, because there is a detail almost everyone overlooked. After the loss, someone close to him expected him to immediately repair things with the third party. They even gave him an opening, the kind of opening that would have allowed him to return to the old pattern without explaining himself. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he did something unexpectedly simple. He declined. Calmly. No anger. No attempt to embarrass anyone. He simply refused to keep participating in something that no longer matched what he felt. That was the moment the atmosphere changed. The third party could handle uncertainty. They could handle distance. What they were not prepared for was clarity. Because clarity cannot easily be competed with. And your soulmate had finally reached the point where he no longer wanted to keep two emotional possibilities alive simply because choosing one felt difficult. There is another layer to this that makes his secret decision even more meaningful. He did not immediately rush toward you either. That might sound confusing at first, but stay till the end, because this is where his choice becomes more mature than anyone expected. He realized that wanting someone and being ready to approach them properly are not the same thing. So rather than making an impulsive gesture after an emotional day, he decided to clear something first. A promise he had made to himself. He would not come toward you carrying unfinished confusion. He would not ask you to trust words while his actions were still divided. And he would not use you as an escape from what happened yesterday. That quiet decision was what truly changed everything. The third party sensed it before anyone explained it. There was no frantic attempt from him to restore what had been lost. No desperate effort to convince them everything could return to normal. Instead, he began removing the little things that had kept him emotionally tied to a situation he had already outgrown. One conversation ended differently. One plan was quietly cancelled. One future assumption was no longer treated as certain. Each action looked small by itself, but together they formed a message impossible to ignore. He was no longer organizing his future around keeping the third party comfortable. And somewhere beneath that shift was a thought he had been avoiding for a long time: if he had one honest chance to build something real, who would he actually want beside him? The answer frightened him less yesterday than it had the day before. Perhaps you have felt something similar in your own life, that strange moment when nothing outwardly dramatic happens, yet inside you know a decision has already been made. Sometimes the heart becomes clear before circumstances catch up. Sometimes people spend weeks explaining what one quiet choice already revealed. Your soulmate had reached that point. He was tired of measuring his feelings according to what others expected. Tired of pretending that familiarity automatically meant belonging. Tired of ignoring the fact that when he thought about peace, honesty, laughter, and the version of himself he actually wanted to become, your presence kept appearing in the same picture. Not perfectly. Not unrealistically. Simply naturally. And that was enough to make yesterday different. Yet there is one detail he has not shared with anyone. After everything settled, after the conversations ended and the noise around him became quiet, he opened something connected to you. Something he had kept for longer than he ever admitted. He stared at it for a while, almost as though he were seeing it differently for the first time. And then he made a second decision, one even the third party does not know about yet. He decided that if he comes toward you again, he will not come halfway. He will bring an answer to the question that has remained between you for far too long. But before he can do that, there is one final conversation he knows he has to have, and what he plans to say in that conversation may explain why yesterday's loss was never really the ending anyone thought it was. The strangest part is that the conversation he feared most has already begun inside his mind. He has rehearsed it in silence more than once, changing the words, removing anything that sounds defensive, trying to find a way to say something honest without hurting anyone unnecessarily. Because the decision he made yesterday was not about humiliating the third party or proving that someone had won. It was about finally refusing to live divided between what was convenient and what felt true. And once he understood that, he could no longer pretend the old arrangement still had a future. Something shifted in him when yesterday's loss exposed how fragile certain expectations had become. People around him assumed he would panic, reach backward, and try to rebuild everything exactly as it had been. Instead, he started asking a quieter question: why was he fighting so hard to preserve something his heart had already stopped choosing? That question stayed with him. It followed him into the evening. It appeared again when his phone became quiet. And when he finally stopped distracting himself, another realization surfaced: he had spent far too much time making decisions based on who might be disappointed rather than who he genuinely wanted to build with. Don't skip, because what happened next was subtle, but it mattered more than any dramatic confession could have. He wrote down 3 things he wanted his future relationship to feel like: peace, honesty, mutual effort. Then he looked at those words for a long time, and one memory of you immediately returned. Not a perfect memory. Not some grand cinematic moment. Something ordinary. A conversation in which he did not have to perform. A moment when he felt understood without carefully explaining every part of himself. And that simple memory did something powerful. It reminded him that the connection he keeps trying to analyze has always been strongest in the places where neither of you was trying too hard. That is what the third party has started sensing now. Their panic is not coming from one event alone. It is coming from noticing that his energy has changed. He is no longer arguing to keep things alive. He is no longer constantly explaining himself. He is becoming quieter, clearer, and more intentional. When someone has finally decided what they do not want, they often stop fighting about it. And that calm distance can reveal more than 100 emotional conversations. Yesterday, the third party attempted to bring up a future plan they had discussed before, expecting him to respond automatically. But he paused. Then he said he did not want to make promises while his feelings were somewhere else. Somewhere else. Those two words changed the room. He did not say your name, but nobody needed him to. The silence afterward carried its own meaning. One person looked away. Another stopped speaking. And the third party understood that the situation had moved beyond jealousy or competition. This was becoming a question of emotional truth. Stay till the end, because his next step is where the title's secret decision becomes impossible to misunderstand. He has decided to stop allowing other people to speak for his heart. For too long, friends, circumstances, timing, and outside opinions shaped the way he handled this connection. Someone told him to wait. Someone told him to forget. Someone suggested that choosing you would complicate everything. Another person convinced him that silence would eventually make the feeling disappear. But silence did not erase it. Distance did not erase it. New distractions did not erase it. If anything, they showed him which feelings were temporary and which ones kept returning with the same quiet consistency. And now he is beginning to understand that perhaps the question was never, why can't I forget this person? The deeper question was, why have I been trying so hard to forget someone who still matters to me? That realization softened something inside him. He stopped treating his feelings like a problem that needed solving and started treating them like information that deserved honesty. This does not mean he believes everything will instantly become easy. He knows there may be questions between you. He knows trust cannot be rebuilt with one emotional sentence. He knows that if he approaches you, he may have to explain why he waited, why he hesitated, and why he allowed outside voices to influence something so personal. Yet strangely, he is less afraid of those questions now. Because for the first time, he would rather face an uncomfortable truth than continue living inside a comfortable uncertainty. Something important is waiting for you, and it lies in what he did shortly before going to sleep. He returned to the item connected to you that he had opened earlier. This time, he did not simply look at it and close it again. He placed it somewhere visible, somewhere he would see it when morning came. A reminder. Not of fantasy. Not of regret. Of a choice he no longer wanted to abandon when fear returned. Then he typed a message. He did not send it. Not yet. He read it once, deleted one sentence, rewrote another, and then stopped at the final line. That line was the first time he had put his decision into words. It said, in essence, that he was finished running from what he already knew. He saved the message instead of sending it because there was still one piece he needed to handle first. The third party deserved clarity, not disappearance. You deserved honesty, not confusion. And he deserved the chance to finally act like the person he kept saying he wanted to become. That is why the conversation ahead matters so much. It is not merely an ending between two people. It is the moment he intends to take responsibility for every mixed signal, every delayed choice, and every time he remained silent because silence seemed easier. But there is something he has not anticipated. The third party has also been preparing for that conversation, and yesterday's loss made them realize he may already be emotionally gone. So they are planning to ask him one direct question, one question he will not be able to answer vaguely anymore. And when they ask it, the person he chooses to name may finally turn his secret decision into something no one in that room can misunderstand. No one expected the question to arrive so calmly. There was no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation, no attempt to make the moment larger than it already was. The third party simply looked at him and asked the one thing they had been avoiding since yesterday: if nothing was standing in your way anymore, who would you actually choose? For a second, everything inside him went still. This was the question he had spent weeks escaping through silence, delay, and half-finished explanations. He could have softened the answer. He could have said he needed time. He could have hidden behind uncertainty one more time. But something about yesterday had removed that option from him. The loss had already shown him what happened when he kept postponing the truth. So this time, he did not rush to protect everyone from discomfort. He allowed the silence to remain. He thought about the future he had pictured the night before. He remembered those 3 words he had written down: peace, honesty, mutual effort. And then he thought of you. Not as an idea. Not as some perfect possibility waiting somewhere in the distance. He thought about the actual connection, including the misunderstandings, the pauses, the things neither of you had said properly, and the moments that somehow continued to matter despite all of it. That was when the third party noticed something in his expression and understood the answer before he spoke. Don't skip, because what he said next was quieter than anyone expected, and perhaps that is why it carried so much weight. He admitted that there was someone he had never fully moved on from. He admitted that every time he tried to convince himself the connection belonged in the past, something inside him resisted. And then he said he did not want to continue building a future with one person while secretly wondering whether his heart belonged somewhere else. He did not blame anyone. He did not turn the conversation into a story about winners or losers. He simply stopped pretending. The third party asked whether this meant you. Again, he paused. But this pause was different. It was not hesitation. It was the realization that once your name entered the room, there would be no hiding behind vague language anymore. And perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen. He said yes. One word. Nothing more. Yet that single word seemed to reorganize everything that had happened over the last few days. The strange distance. The unanswered questions. The way his attention had shifted. The secret decision. Suddenly, none of it looked accidental. The third party had believed yesterday's loss had created his uncertainty. Now they understood the loss had merely exposed a decision already forming beneath the surface. Something important is waiting for you here, because after saying your name, he did something unexpected. He did not immediately reach for his phone. He did not turn the moment into an impulsive declaration. Instead, he told the third party that choosing you in his heart did not automatically give him the right to appear in your life as though nothing had happened. That sentence surprised everyone. He understood that wanting you was only the beginning. If he truly meant what he had just admitted, he would have to show it through consistency, patience, and a willingness to hear your side without defending himself. He would have to accept that you may have changed while he was hesitating. He would have to approach you with respect instead of assuming the connection had simply been waiting exactly where he left it. That realization made his choice feel different. More grounded. More real. For perhaps the first time, he was not asking, "How do I get this person back?" He was asking, "How do I become honest enough to deserve a real conversation with them?" And that question changed his next move completely. The third party became quiet after that. The panic they had been carrying since yesterday softened into something closer to understanding. They could finally see that there was no clever argument capable of changing what he had just admitted. This was not a temporary reaction to disappointment. It was a recognition that he had been living out of alignment with his own feelings. And strangely, once the truth was spoken, the tension in the room became lighter. Painful perhaps, but clearer. Sometimes uncertainty is heavier than honesty. Sometimes the moment everyone fears becomes the first moment everyone can finally breathe. Stay till the end, because what happened after that conversation reveals why he still has not sent the message he wrote. When he was alone again, he opened it and read the final line one more time. He almost pressed send. His thumb hovered there for several seconds. But then another thought stopped him. A message could be misunderstood. Words on a screen could never carry everything he needed to explain. He wanted you to hear the pause in his voice when he admitted he had been afraid. He wanted you to understand that he was not coming toward you because yesterday went badly somewhere else. He wanted you to know that yesterday simply forced him to stop lying to himself about something that had been true for much longer. So he made another decision. The message would not be the confession. It would only open the door. Short. Respectful. No pressure. No promises he had not yet earned. Just enough to ask whether you would be willing to have one honest conversation. And then something happened that he was completely unprepared for. While editing that message, he found an older exchange between the two of you, something you had written long ago that he barely understood at the time. He read it once. Then again. The words were simple, but now they felt almost painfully clear. You had already told him exactly what you needed from him. Not perfection. Not grand gestures. Clarity. You had asked, in your own way, for him to stop leaving you in a space where you had to guess what he felt. Back then, he thought you were asking too much because he had not yet learned how expensive uncertainty could become. Now he finally understood. And for several minutes, he simply sat there, realizing that the thing you had wanted from him all along was the very thing he had finally become ready to give. That memory changed the message again. He deleted the complicated explanation. He removed the sentences, trying too hard to sound impressive. What remained was honest and surprisingly simple. He told you there was something he should have said a long time ago. He told you he had finally made a decision he did not want fear to undo. And he asked whether you would let him explain it properly. But just as he was about to send it, another notification appeared on his screen. A message from someone who knew both of you. And what that person told him about you made him freeze, not because it changed who he wanted, but because it suddenly made him realize that while he had been finding the courage to choose you, you may have quietly made a decision of your own. The message on his screen did not say what he expected. It was not a warning, not a dramatic revelation, not someone trying to pull him in another direction. It was quieter than that, and somehow more powerful. The person who knew both of you simply told him that you had changed. Not in a cold way. Not in a way meant to punish anyone. You had begun protecting your peace more carefully. You were no longer waiting for unclear signals to become answers. You had started making decisions based on what was actually happening in your life instead of what might happen someday. And as he read those words, something inside him dropped into stillness. For so long, he had assumed time was standing still around this connection. He had imagined that whenever he finally became ready, the door would somehow remain exactly where he left it. But now he was forced to consider something he had avoided. What if you had learned to live without needing an answer from him? What if your heart had become stronger during his hesitation? What if the person he wanted to return to was no longer waiting to be chosen, because you had finally chosen yourself? Don't skip, because this realization did not make him retreat. It did the opposite. For the first time, he understood that if he approached you, it could not be with entitlement. He could not assume your feelings had remained untouched. He could not appear with a confession and expect the past to reopen on command. He would have to meet you where you are now, not where he remembers you being. And strangely, that thought made his decision even clearer. He was not choosing you because he believed you belonged to him. He was choosing honesty because he finally understood that whatever happened next needed to be real. If you had moved forward, he would respect it. If you needed time, he would give it. If you were willing to listen, he would finally speak without hiding. That was the moment his secret decision became something deeper than emotion. It became responsibility. The third party had been in total panic because yesterday's loss made them feel everything slipping away, but your soulmate was experiencing something entirely different. He was beginning to accept that love could not be protected by keeping everyone uncertain. Someone always ends up carrying the weight of that confusion. Sometimes it is the third party. Sometimes it is the person waiting for clarity. Sometimes it is the person creating the confusion themselves. And he could finally see how exhausting that pattern had become. Something important is waiting for you, because he opened the unsent message again, but this time his intention had changed. Earlier, he wanted to explain himself. Now, he wanted to acknowledge you. There is a difference. One focuses on being understood. The other begins by understanding what the other person may have lived through. He removed another sentence. Then another. Finally, the message became simple enough that he could no longer hide behind beautiful words. He wrote that he had been unfair by leaving too much unspoken. He wrote that he did not expect anything from you, but there was something honest he wanted to say if you were ever willing to hear it. And then he stopped. No dramatic promise. No attempt to make you feel responsible for his emotions. Just clarity. He stared at the message for a long time, because sending it would mean accepting something he had never fully accepted before. Your response was not under his control. Yet maybe that was the final lesson yesterday's loss had been trying to teach him. A real choice does not guarantee an outcome. It simply reveals who you are willing to be, even when the outcome remains uncertain. He had spent too long making decisions only when he believed he could predict what would happen afterward. With you, he could not predict anything anymore. And still, your name remained the one answer that felt honest when the third party asked who he wanted. That mattered. Stay till the end, because the person who messaged him had not finished. A second message arrived a few minutes later. This one contained a detail about you that made him sit upright. Apparently, not long ago, someone had casually mentioned his name around you. They expected you either to become emotional or immediately change the subject. Instead, you went quiet for a moment and said something remarkably calm. You said that you wished him well, but you were no longer willing to build your life around unanswered questions. When he read that, he did not feel rejected. He felt seen. Because those words reflected the exact mistake he had finally admitted to himself. You were not asking for some impossible version of love. You were asking not to be kept in uncertainty. And now he understood that if there was still any path between you, it would have to begin there. Not with chemistry. Not with nostalgia. Not with promises about the future. With an answer. A clear one. That is why he finally pressed send. The message left his screen before he could reconsider it. For several seconds, he simply stared at the empty space beneath it. No immediate reply appeared. And something surprising happened. He did not panic. He did not send another message. He did not try to explain more. He placed the phone down and allowed you to have your space. That quiet act revealed just how much had changed in him since yesterday. The old version of him would have tried to control the silence. This version understood that silence could also be respect. Meanwhile, the third party was beginning to hear through mutual connections that he had become unusually settled after their conversation. That unsettled them because they had expected his certainty to collapse once he was alone. Instead, it seemed to deepen. Yet their panic was slowly turning into another realization of their own. Perhaps yesterday's loss had not taken something away from them as much as it had exposed something neither person should continue pretending about. There was sadness in that recognition, but also a strange relief. Because when someone chooses clearly, everyone can eventually stop competing with a possibility that was never fully theirs. Hours later, your soulmate checked his phone again. Still nothing. He took a breath, put it away, and continued with his evening. Then, much later than he expected, the screen lit up. Your name appeared. The message was short. Almost too short to reveal what you were feeling. He opened it slowly. You had not said yes. You had not said no. You had written only that you had seen his message, and that if he truly wanted an honest conversation, there was one question you needed him to answer first. He read that line twice. Then the next sentence appeared beneath it, and suddenly he understood why everything that happened yesterday had only been preparing him for this moment. Because the question you asked was not, "Do you still love me?" It was far more difficult than that. You asked him why, if he had known deep down who he wanted for so long, he had waited until now to finally choose. For the first time, he had no answer ready. Your question reached past every explanation he had rehearsed, past every careful sentence, past the version of the story that made his hesitation sound understandable. Why had he waited until now? He stared at those words longer than he expected, because somewhere inside him he knew you were not asking for another beautiful confession. You were asking for the truth beneath the confession. And that truth was harder to admit. He had not waited because he felt nothing. He had waited because feeling something real required him to make choices he was afraid to make. He had convinced himself that uncertainty was safer than responsibility. As long as he never fully chose, he never had to fully risk being wrong. As long as he kept one foot in the familiar and one foot near the possibility of you, he could tell himself he was still figuring things out. But your question forced him to recognize what that uncertainty had cost. While he was protecting himself from a difficult decision, you had been left carrying questions he should have answered much sooner. Don't skip, because what he finally wrote back was not the answer anyone around him would have expected. He did not blame timing. He did not blame the third party. He did not blame friends, circumstances, or confusion, even though all of those things had influenced him. He wrote that the deepest reason was fear. Not fear of you, but fear of becoming accountable to what he already knew. He admitted that choosing you would have required him to disappoint people who had expectations of him. It would have required him to stop hiding behind what seemed easier. And perhaps most difficult of all, it would have required him to believe that a connection could be meaningful without having complete control over how it ended. He told you that he had spent too long trying to guarantee an outcome before offering honesty. Yesterday's loss finally showed him that certainty never arrives in the way people expect. Sometimes clarity only appears after something stops working. Sometimes a person does not recognize what they truly value until the noise around them becomes quiet enough to hear themselves again. He read his message several times before sending it. Then he added one final sentence: "You should have received clarity from me long before I became brave enough to give it." That line was difficult for him to write because it asked for nothing in return. It did not try to turn his regret into your responsibility. It simply acknowledged something he could no longer deny. He sent it. This time, your reply came sooner. You told him that his honesty mattered, but you needed to understand one more thing. Was he reaching out because yesterday's loss had made him lonely, or had yesterday simply forced him to admit something that existed before it happened? The difference mattered to you, and he immediately understood why. You did not want to become someone's second choice after another situation fell apart. You did not want a temporary emotional reaction disguised as destiny. You wanted to know whether his decision had roots deeper than one difficult day. Something important is waiting for you, because this was the moment he finally stopped trying to persuade you and started remembering. He thought back through the months he had spent avoiding what he felt. There had been moments long before yesterday when he almost contacted you. Nights when he opened your old conversations and then closed them again. Ordinary places that unexpectedly reminded him of something you once said. Decisions about his future where he caught himself imagining what you would think. Even during times when everything around him looked settled, there had been a quiet part of him that knew something remained unfinished. Yesterday did not create that feeling. It removed the excuses surrounding it. He wrote this to you carefully. He told you that if yesterday had never happened, he might have continued delaying the truth for longer, but the truth itself would still have been there. That was the part he regretted most. He should not have needed a loss to become honest. Yet he also refused to pretend the lesson had not changed him. He told you he was not asking you to trust one emotional evening. He was asking for the chance to show, slowly and consistently, whether his actions could finally match what he was saying. Then came another pause. The kind of pause that once would have sent him into overthinking. But this time, he let it remain. And while he waited, something else was unfolding elsewhere. The third party had begun replaying their own conversation with him, especially the moment he spoke your name. At first, they had interpreted his choice as something taken from them. But as the hours passed, another possibility began to emerge. Perhaps what hurt was not that he suddenly chose someone else. Perhaps it was realizing he had never been fully present in the way they had hoped. That realization softened their panic into disappointment, and then into clarity of their own. They began to understand that continuing to hold on to someone whose heart was elsewhere would only prolong a situation that had already become emotionally unfair to everyone involved. There was no dramatic victory in this. No villain. No one needed to be humiliated. Sometimes three people can become tangled in a situation simply because one person delays an honest decision. And sometimes the kindest ending is the one that finally stops pretending. Stay till the end, because your next message changed the entire tone of the conversation. You did not tell him everything was forgiven. You did not offer an immediate reunion. Instead, you wrote that if he truly wanted to speak honestly, you would listen, but only if he came without trying to control what happened afterward. He smiled when he read that, not because he believed it meant he had won you back, but because he recognized how much stronger your boundaries had become. The person he remembered cared deeply, but the person speaking to him now had learned not to abandon themselves while caring. And unexpectedly, that made him respect you even more. He replied that he understood. Then you agreed to speak. Not immediately. Not in some emotionally charged rush. You chose a time that allowed both of you to arrive calmly. That detail meant more to him than he expected. In the past, he might have tried to accelerate everything because he feared losing the opportunity. Now he saw patience as part of proving that his decision was real. Over the next several hours, he resisted the temptation to create the perfect speech. Instead, he wrote down the things he knew he needed to own. Where he had been unclear. Where he had allowed outside opinions to become louder than his own judgment. Where he had mistaken avoiding conflict for protecting people. Where he had expected you to understand feelings he had never expressed properly. Each sentence made him quieter. Because for the first time, he was seeing this connection not only from the perspective of what he felt, but from the perspective of what you may have experienced. That shift mattered. It changed the question from, "Will you choose me?" into, "Can I show you that I have learned how to choose clearly?" And that distinction was beginning to shape everything. The following day, shortly before the conversation was supposed to happen, he received an unexpected message from the third party. For a moment, he worried it might reopen everything. Instead, the message was surprisingly calm. They told him they had been thinking about what he said, and although yesterday had been painful, they did not want him making decisions out of guilt toward them. They wanted clarity too. They asked him only one thing: if he had truly decided where his heart was, he should not return later simply because the future became difficult. He read those words carefully. There was sadness in them, but also dignity. And he responded with the same honesty he had finally begun giving everyone. He said he would not make promises about circumstances he could not control, but he would not use uncertainty as an excuse to keep emotional doors half open anymore. For the first time, the third party believed him. The panic that had followed yesterday's loss finally began settling, because even painful truth can feel lighter than endless competition. Then the time arrived. Your name appeared on his phone, and for several seconds he simply looked at it. This was the moment he had imagined in so many different forms, yet now that it was real, the dramatic words he had prepared no longer seemed important. He answered. Your voice was calm. Familiar, but different. There was warmth there, though carefully protected. Neither of you rushed. There was no instant return to the way things used to be. And strangely, that made the conversation feel more meaningful. He began by telling you the one thing he knew he had to say without decoration. He was sorry that his hesitation had made you question something he should have communicated clearly. You listened. He continued, explaining that yesterday's loss had not made him suddenly want you. It had exposed the fact that he had been trying to build around a truth he was afraid to face. Then he told you about the question the third party had asked: if nothing stood in his way, who would he choose? There was a silence on your side of the call. He did not fill it. Finally, you asked what he had said. He took a slow breath and answered exactly as he had answered before. Your name. Another pause followed, but this one carried something different. Not shock. Not immediate relief. Almost recognition. As though some part of you had once suspected this, but had stopped allowing yourself to depend on it. Then you said something he had not prepared for. You told him that hearing he chose you mattered, but it was not the thing you had been waiting to hear. His heart tightened slightly. He asked what you meant. And your answer became the next turning point. You said you had never needed him to prove that someone else mattered less. You needed to know what he saw in a future with you that made him finally willing to become different. That question silenced him completely, because it was no longer about the third party, yesterday's loss, or the past. It was about what came next. And as he sat there searching for the most honest answer he could give, he realized the decision that proved who he really wanted was only the beginning. The deeper secret was why choosing you had made him reconsider the kind of man he wanted to become. What he said next surprised even him, because for once he was not searching for the perfect answer, he was searching for the truest one. He told you that the future he imagined with you did not feel exciting because it promised perfection. It felt meaningful because it challenged him to become more honest, more present, more intentional. With you, he could no longer hide inside vague intentions and expect them to be understood. He would have to speak clearly. He would have to show up consistently. He would have to stop expecting love to survive on feelings alone. And as those words left him, he realized something he had never fully understood before. Perhaps the reason this connection had remained in his heart was not simply because of what you made him feel, but because of who he became whenever he stopped running from what you represented. You represented truth without performance. A kind of closeness where words mattered because actions eventually had to support them. A future where choosing someone meant continuing to choose how you treated them after the emotional moment had passed. You listened quietly, and your silence no longer frightened him. He had finally learned that not every pause needed to be rescued. Sometimes a pause meant someone was deciding whether your words matched the person they had known. Don't skip, because the next thing you said changed the conversation in a way neither of you expected. You told him that there had been a time when hearing those words would have been enough. Months ago, perhaps you would have accepted the confession immediately, because your heart was still waiting for proof that what you felt had been real. But you were different now. You had spent too much time learning how to stop measuring your worth by someone else's hesitation. And while part of you still cared, another part had learned to protect the life you had rebuilt. He did not interrupt. That alone told you something. The old version of him might have rushed to reassure you, might have promised that everything would be different, might have tried to turn your uncertainty into a problem he needed to solve immediately. This time, he simply said he understood. Then he asked a question that made you go quiet. What would make this feel safe enough to explore without either of us pretending the past never happened? There was no pressure hidden inside the question. No demand for an answer. Just curiosity. And perhaps that was why you answered honestly. You said you did not need big promises. You needed small evidence. Consistency. Clear communication. Space to ask difficult questions without being treated as though you were creating problems. You needed him to understand that trust might return slowly, if it returned at all. And most importantly, you needed to know that his choice would remain his choice even if rebuilding the connection took longer than he hoped. He listened to every word. Something important is waiting for you, because when you finished, he did not say, "I can do all of that." Instead, he said something more grounded, "Then let me show you slowly, and you can decide based on what you actually experience." That answer softened something inside you. Not enough to erase the past. Not enough to suddenly remove every question. But enough to make the conversation feel different from the ones you remembered. He was not asking you to believe in potential anymore. He was giving you permission to judge the present. That was a subtle shift, but it mattered. Meanwhile, the third party was experiencing their own unexpected turning point. The panic that had followed yesterday's loss was fading, replaced by the strange clarity that comes when you stop trying to change an answer you already received. They had spent so much energy wondering what they could have done differently that they had forgotten to ask whether they truly wanted a relationship where they had to compete with someone who remained emotionally significant. And for the first time, they allowed themselves to admit that they deserved clarity too. They began removing their own expectations from the situation. Not angrily. Not as revenge. Simply because holding on to someone who had openly acknowledged another connection no longer felt like self-respect. That decision meant your soulmate's choice now carried even more responsibility. There was no longer a triangle to hide inside. No blurred lines to blame. No convenient confusion. If he moved toward you, it would be because he had decided to. If he disappeared again, that would also be his decision. And he knew it. Stay till the end, because after the call ended, he did not feel the rush of victory he once imagined he would feel. Instead, he felt something quieter and more serious, relief mixed with responsibility. You had not promised him anything. Yet somehow, the uncertainty felt healthier now than the old certainty ever had, because this uncertainty was honest. He knew where you stood. You knew where he stood. Everything after that would be built from actions rather than assumptions. He looked again at the notes he had written before the conversation, then crossed out nearly half of them. He no longer needed speeches about destiny or perfect timing. The call had shown him that what mattered now was ordinary behavior. Replying when he said he would. Keeping plans. Being transparent when something bothered him. Not disappearing when the conversation became uncomfortable. Letting the relationship breathe instead of constantly demanding reassurance. These were not dramatic gestures, but they were the exact things he had once underestimated. And over the next few days, something began changing between you in small ways. A message arrived when he said it would. A conversation ended without confusion. He remembered a detail you had mentioned and followed up on it later. When you needed space, he did not interpret it as rejection. When he felt uncertain, he asked instead of assuming. None of these moments were extraordinary on their own, but together they created something you had not felt with him in a long time: emotional steadiness. That steadiness affected him too. He started realizing how much energy he had wasted trying to predict every possible outcome. With you, he was learning to stay present instead. He could not know exactly what this would become, but he could know how he behaved today. And for the first time, that felt enough. Then came an unexpected test. Someone close to him brought up the third party again, casually asking whether he had reconsidered now that some time had passed. In the past, a question like that might have pulled him into another cycle of doubt. This time, he answered almost immediately. He said he respected what had happened, but he was not going backward simply because moving forward required patience. Those words reached the third party eventually, and instead of reigniting panic, they confirmed what they had already begun accepting. His decision had not been a reaction to one bad day. It was holding steady even after the emotions settled. That was the proof everyone had been waiting for. Not his confession. Not your name spoken in a quiet room. Not the message he sent late at night. Consistency after the moment had passed. And when you heard about it indirectly, something inside you noticed too. You did not suddenly surrender every boundary, but you began wondering whether perhaps this time he really understood the difference between wanting someone and choosing them. Wanting is a feeling. Choosing is behavior repeated over time. That distinction became the foundation beneath everything happening next. Then one evening, during a calm conversation, you asked him a question that caught him completely off guard. You asked whether he had ever imagined what would have happened if yesterday's loss had never taken place. Would he still have eventually chosen you? He became quiet. It would have been easy to give you the comforting answer immediately. But he had promised himself he would stop using easy answers when the truth was more complicated. So he admitted that he did not know when he would have found the courage. Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe he would have continued postponing things until another moment forced him to look inward. But then he added something important: the loss did not determine his choice. It exposed how long he had been avoiding it. That distinction mattered to you. You could hear that he was no longer rewriting history to make himself look better. He was willing to admit his weakness without allowing it to define what he did next. And then, almost unexpectedly, you told him something you had never shared before. There had been a moment weeks earlier when you had almost reached out to him. You had written a message, stared at it, and then deleted it because you realized you did not want to keep being the person who reopened a door he had not clearly chosen. He went completely silent. That revelation affected him more deeply than anything else you had said. Because suddenly he understood how close the two of you had been to speaking sooner, and how his hesitation had quietly shaped your decisions too. He asked what the message had said. At first, you hesitated. Then you told him only the final line. It was simple: if you ever know what you truly want, I hope you are brave enough to say it. He closed his eyes for a moment when he heard that. Yesterday's loss, the third party's question, the unsent message, the conversation you were having now, they all seemed to lead back to those words. Not because some perfect story had been waiting to unfold, but because both of you had reached the same lesson from opposite directions. You had learned not to wait indefinitely for someone else's clarity. He had learned that clarity means nothing unless it becomes action. And just when the conversation seemed ready to soften into something peaceful, you told him there was one more truth he needed to know before either of you took another step. Something you had intentionally kept from him while he was sorting through his feelings. Something connected to a decision you had made for your own future long before he finally chose you. He asked what it was, and for the first time since this journey began, he realized he was no longer the only person carrying a secret decision.